This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. It's great to be back on the last Friday of the month. Fantastic to have you all with me again. So, today I'll be talking all things SEND with my guests. Is it in crisis? What can be done? Are things improving? And if not, how could they?
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Hello, everyone. So it's that time of the month. I'm back. It's great to be with you all today. I've got some fantastic guests lined up. Thanks to you all listening, both in England and across the world. I know I've had some listeners tuning in, particularly from Australia recently, which is fantastic. So the latest report into the state of SEND in education, just published this month, had this to say: the system to support children and young people with special educational needs in England is reaching, or arguably has already reached, crisis point. It's also noted that since 2015, there has been a 140% increase in the number of students with an EHC plan. Given the attention this is currently getting, rightfully so, I thought it would be a good idea to discuss the state of SEND in England's education system with those working and managing this section across a different variety of educational providers. So hopefully the first two guests are with me, Michal and Kelly. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Cool. And Kelly?
Yep, I can too.
Oh, fantastic. So you're coming through nice and clear, which is great. So I thought the best way to start was just for you guys to introduce yourselves and tell us about your background in SEND, your sort of history in education, and what you're doing now. So let's start with you, Michal.
Thank you very much, David. So my name is Michal, and I've been in SEND for over 20 years in the UK. Been in leadership for over 10 years, and Kelly and I have been co-heads for in SEND schools, and my recent job is director of specialist settings for a trust overseeing 5 special schools.
Okay, and yourself, Kelly?
Yeah, hi David. I'm Kelly. I also have been in special education for over 20 years. I've been really lucky. I've worked in both SEMH residential environments, both the maintained and the private sector, PMLD, SLD, and MLD, and everything in between. I'm currently in an SLD provision, which is spread across 3 campuses. And I'm also a parent of a young person who is on an EOTAS package, which is education other than at school or college, having just been through the tribunal process as a parent too.
Okay, so I know there's going to be a lot of acronyms in tonight's show, so I just noticed one of them. Could you explain to our listeners what an SLD school is?
So we do love acronyms in education. So SLD is severe learning needs or difficulties. MLD is mild learning difficulties. SEMH is social, emotional, mental health needs.
Okay, fantastic. And I guess just for our listeners who aren't sure, could you explain what SEND actually stands for?
In England, it stands for Special Educational Needs or Differences, difficulties, depending on who you're talking with. Unlike in Wales, it's ALN, which is arguably a more progressive way of describing differences in learning, and their terminology for that is like additional learning needs.
Okay, I guess that's not a bad question to start with, because recently the news for SEND in the UK, Tom Rees, said he wants to retire the term SEND. So I'll start with you, Kelly. Is that something you would agree with?
Oh, it's yeah.
Nice question, easy one to start with.
It's a great question.
I mean, it's such a contentious issue for a variety of reasons. And, like any use of language, how it's applied has a real impact on who it's applied to and how they're engaged in the conversation around how they want to be regarded, or what language you want to use to describe them. I personally struggle with that kind of word of special. It doesn't feel very respectful. At times it can feel quite ableist. And often it's associated as a nice way of saying less than, which does not sit well for me at all. Michal, I know you feel strongly about this.
Yeah, and I think off of that, David, like our big thing is about, we recently went to a conference, and I love the person who was sharing was talking about how we were all neurodiverse, but within that neurodiversity, there are people who are neurodivergent. And I think that's really, really important. Like when you say things like send children or send young adults or adults have superpowers, it's not about that. We're all neurodiverse. And actually within that, our brains function in different ways. And therefore we are neurodivergent in how we experience the world.
So I guess my next question is just coming to the report. So I want to talk a lot about there's been a lot of reports, obviously, in SEN. There was the 2023 report from the Conservatives, and you've got the latest one. And this is what got me interested, is there's been a report just in this month. But another nice, easy question to start with. So obviously in the report, it said that the system to support children and young people with special educational needs in England is reaching, or arguably has already reached, crisis point. So I just want your initial thoughts on that. Is that the right terminology? Michal, would you say it has reached crisis point?
I mean, yes, I think I would say that that's quite accurate, in the sense that it is at crisis point because the systems haven't changed since Victorian times, right? The education system was built on industrial periods. It was built on, the curriculum was built on what industrial education, when industrial period is happening, the education system was built for that. And it hasn't necessarily drastically changed since then, right? Since the Victorian times and so forth. So the reason it's kind of hit crisis point because nothing has changed. So we're still doing very much that. And lots of SEN people will agree with that kind of square peg, round hole kind of. And I know it's like a terminology that's used a lot and has been for years, but we've spent a lot of time trying to fit lots of people into that square peg, and so that's why it's hitting crisis point, because nothing is actually changed and we're reacting. We're a very reactive culture at the moment.
I mean, if I may, I would say something slightly different. I think it broke a long time ago. I think the nature of our political system means that they're always on catch up. And very rarely is it research informed at the depth of which it serves everybody. We've got a lot of generalization that goes on within our education system. Again, as Michal said, that one size has to fit all, or maybe the onus is on the child in fitting the system as it is, as opposed to anything, child-centered, which the legislation around SEND in England is supposed to be, with the child at the heart of the design and the professionals around a young person. And I think it broke a long time ago. So it could be very, very difficult to do anything vastly different and vastly improving a system that's pretty much burnt to the ground already.
So we might think about solutions a little bit later, but I want to dig into this idea about, so can you explain to the listeners what an EHC plan is before we get into the issues around it?
I'm going to let Kelly do that one because she has experienced this in real life terms.
So EHCP simply stands for Education Healthcare Plan. It's a fairly new document with legislation that came in around 2014, 2015. And it's essentially a legal document that states the needs of a young person. It is supposed to be collaborative. So any professional who's involved with a young person is supposed to collaborate on it. usually through a meeting and reports that are provided. And then somebody who chairs the meeting, quite often an educational professional or a local authority professional, will chair that meeting and then make notes and recommendations about what should exist on an annual basis. And that's in an annual review meeting. And then what's supposed to happen is that the annual review meeting then informs an update of the EHCP. Many children don't experience those updates because the system is so jammed and logged, which can often mean the EHCPs are vastly out of date. And that can prove problematic when you're thinking about provision and what's needed. But essentially, it's there to protect young person and make sure they get the provision they need in order to meet the needs that have been identified by those professionals.
So I guess I've got quite a few questions about it. I mean, the first one is this startling statistic that since 2015, there's been a 140% increase in the number of students with an EHC plan. I mean, it's a really difficult question, but do you have any sense of why there's been such a massive increase? Is it just greater awareness? What would be the reasons for that?
I think some of it is awareness, David. Like, I think people are much more like finding out more about themselves and finding out. I mean, there's high statistics about adults also being diagnosed now, more so than ever. I think people are realizing more about how our children, young people are functioning in the world and finding regulation and what that means, so absolutely. But I know I'm going to repeat myself that I think it does go back to the way the education system is built and how children are not fitting into that mold anymore like they used to,
What are your thoughts, Kelly?
I mean, for me, there are several different intersecting factors that have gone on since the introduction of that Children's and Families Act in 2014. To talk very loosely to them, yeah, absolutely, there has been greater awareness and diagnosis. We know more, we do better. Once upon a time, white boys were the only people who could be autistic. Now we know much more about neurodiverse brains and what that can manifest like for every individual across, a great range of sectors. There is some mainstream capacity challenges. So unfortunately, with the erosion of school budgets and the lack of specialist training, children aren't getting what they need within those environments. And so then they're looking to find an avenue whereby they can get their child what they need, because those mainstream environments are so underfunded. They don't have a hope to be able to be as progressive as they might choose to be had they had the funds available to them. Over that kind of same period, there's definitely been a decline in local authority services. So things like cuts to early intervention and on statutory services like speech therapy, CAMS, educational psychology. Previously, you'd be able to access that without necessarily needing a formal route. But because those cuts to those early intervention services have happened, families and young people have no choice other than to go through the EHCP route. Parents have become more informed, which can be a double-edged sword, I appreciate, depending on what perspective you want to take on that. But there's also legal precedent that supports it. So the high success rate in tribunals absolutely suggests that the processes of getting EHCPs by LAs are not being followed lawfully. So it forces families into having to go down that route as well. We also can't overlook the fact that we extended post-16 support. EHCPs cover 0 to 25. Previously, in the old system, which was statements, only went to 19. So naturally, there was going to be an increase in EHCPs in the system anyway, which is great because we've got more young people staying in education or training with support needs captured within those plans. And finally, unfortunately, with the system as it is now, EHCP is perceived as the only way to access certain therapies. accessing transport for children who are placed in schools, which can be up to over an hour away from their home environment, as well as getting the right placement type. We don't have village schools as much as we used to in smaller settings, and children are being shipped quite vast geographical distances just to access a provision that's designated to support the level of need that young person has.
I think the issue, though, David, with what Kelly's saying is that the other side of that is that the people who are in the settings, like mainstream settings, don't have the resources to provide for those students, but also they don't necessarily have the time and energy to learn and be educated on how to support them. So even though we might be privy to more information, and so therefore parents are like, oh yes, I can have an EHCP because my child needs to have this kind of input to help them be able to be independent and be successful in the world. The schools themselves, as they stand, don't have the resource and the capacity to train those adults to be able to have them in the setting that they're in. So even though the setting might not be right, the adult also doesn't have that capacity, or not being invested in the capacity to be able to have that. So that's when parents are becoming much more empowered to be like, the louder I speak, and this is the thing about the tribunal systems and local authorities, that parents have found that like the only way I'm going to get what I want is if I shout and scream and be consistent, and because they've seen the success stories because of that. And that's really unfortunate, really.
I'm going to counter that, though, because actually parents aren't fighting and screaming. They're actually just asking for their child to have the same right to equal education as any other child in the system. What I didn't do was scream and shout. I just asked for what my young person needed. Yeah. And my 20 years in the system was ignored by the system. So what my daughter has, that wasn't what I wanted for her. I don't want my daughter to be ostracized from a system, separated and segregated from her peers, yet that's what the system facilitated for us. Yeah. So I don't think it's about parents screaming and shouting. It's about being aware and also advocating for children to have equal access.
I mean, it's a startling statistic that I'm looking at. So like only 2.5% of local authority decisions on EHCs were appealed. That's 2023. I've got the stats here for. Of these, however, the tribunals were wholly in favor of parents and carers in 98% of the cases, which is, somewhat a staggering statistic. I mean, I guess my next question before we get to what teachers could be looking at is, how straightforward, and probably it sounds like, Kelly, you're sort of more attuned to this maybe in your experience, but how straightforward are the EHCPs to negotiate for parents?
We are laughing because it is not. It is not.
I'm guessing that's a no. Yeah.
And I think it depends on the local authority. Like each local authority is different. This is the thing. There is not necessary continuity between the local authorities and the way they work and how they function. Different systems and different schools run them differently as well. Parents are having to navigate a system. They're not reviewed as they should be. And of course, absolutely, Kelly's got a real lived experience. I mean, we both do as head teachers because we've seen so many EHCPs come through our schools and consultations, but her real life experience as a parent will probably give you what that really feels like.
The thing is, tribunals apply the law, not the budget.
That's right.
So at local level, at local authority level, decisions are often resource-based, based on budgets, what they've got available to them, whether it be types of provision or, money for certain therapies. And lots of local authorities are going into deficit. They're being asked to make hard decisions, which includes cuts to services that serve the most vulnerable young people and people in our society. But they're not resourced as well as they need to be in order to be able to do that. So I understand that's difficult. But when we talk just about the EHCP, before we even get to kind of trying to fund it, the short answer to are EHCP straightforward is no, not really. So what makes them complex? Well, language and jargon, the whole documentation, the whole process, as a parent, you have to fight to understand. And that's okay, I guess, if you're a head teacher with 20 years experience who qualified in her degree with English. But if you're not, if you've got any kind of differences, it's such a thick document of jargon-related words or non-specific language, it can be really, really hard to make sense of it, especially when you're actually likely to be in a time of crisis with your young person.
Yeah, and the question.
EHCPs, sorry, Dave.
Oh, sorry, I was just thinking, how much then is socioeconomic? That would be sort of the thing that leaped out to me when you were saying that. Does
Yeah.
that mean it's
Mhm.
very shaped by socioeconomic circumstances and education?
And I think it
It's
can
a barrier.
be. Yeah, it's a barrier because people who can afford it can have it. But I think some of it's also understanding, right? Like what Kelly's talking about with language and jargon. Like even really people who've got really great intentions, even Senko specialist people, they understanding what cognition is, what sensory needs are, what, and a lot of times, because again, like historically, if we are looking at behavior for behavior's sake, then a lot of the EHCP is going to deal with that. And remember, who sees that EHCP? Well, it could be a practitioner that says, oh gosh, we can't meet that need because of what's written there. So everyone is going to have their unconscious bias about what that looks like. So it doesn't connect, right, David? There's no bridge and connection. It needs to be some consistency in how we do that. And everybody's going to have their own lived experience of that and backgrounds of that. It's just starting. It's bubbling, isn't it? We can feel it.
Yeah.
I think the intention was for it to be really connected. Like the intention was good.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, both education, health and social care, the services, they operate on different timelines and criterias. And so it can be really hard to coordinate all the people around the table, which leads to gaps as well as delays. It's a really difficult process for many people to be involved in, even with the best intention.
Yeah. So fantastic. So we're going to go to our first ad break. When we come back, I'd really like to focus on, ways that teachers can actually make improvements in their own setting and things that we might be able to think about practically in terms of moving forward. So let's go to our first ad break now.
Hi, secondary school teachers. We're Apps for Good, and we give schools like yours free introductory computing courses. Our courses are for everyone, including those who aren't computing teachers, and they're fully equipped with resources mapped to the UK computing curriculums. Independent learning is central to our courses. Your students will develop essential and digital skills by working in teams to create prototype apps. We'll even connect you with industry volunteers to give real-world feedback. Let's empower every young person you teach to shape their future with technology. Speak to us at www.appsforgood.org.
Did you know that every year, half of disadvantaged children who are top attainers at primary school don't go on to achieve top GCSE maths results? At Axiom Maths, we exist to change that. Our fully funded program helps schools nurture young mathematicians through weekly face-to-face maths circles, where pupils tackle challenging and exciting problems outside the national curriculum. With just under £3,000 annual funding, expert training and quality resources, we give schools everything they need to inspire the next generation of mathematical thinkers. Want to make a difference? Visit AxiomMaths.com today and join over 400 schools delivering maths circles across the UK.
Meet 2025 BET Award winner Kialo EDU, the 100% free tool for thoughtful, inclusive classroom discussion. On Kialo, students contribute instantly and simultaneously to create an interactive map of a discussion, deepening their subject knowledge and enhancing their critical thinking skills. Set tasks, track participation, and provide personalized feedback in just a few clicks. And since it's compatible with all your favorite LMS platforms, it slots seamlessly into your existing workflow. Over 1 million educators and students are already using Kialo to make the world a more thoughtful place. Join them today at kialo-edu.com.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is
Fantastic. So we're back. So one of the questions I wanted to ask just before we move on is this idea of the postcard lottery. It comes up in a lot of the reports. I'm just going to unmute Michal. So what are your thoughts on that, Kelly, to start with? Is that a key problem, this idea about the postcard lottery?
Oh, I think so. I mean, we know, don't we, just generally the north-south divide is evidenced. You know, it exists. It's there in terms of how local authorities are funded, what money goes where and who gets access to it. In theory, the child's needs should determine the support they get, right? But in practice, it is a postcode lottery. So I can give a clear example of that. I get less money than a local authority who is 5 minutes drive away from me per child to spend on their needs. And that's just by virtue of living, you know, a few roads away. And that's bigger, you know, depending on where you are geographically. There can be quite a huge gap between per pupil funding over those areas. So it's inevitable that some people will get less as a result, unfortunately.
I think that that's probably true in terms of like how much funding comes in for per student. But I think the other bit of that is also about how the funding is being used. So, you know, working in certain local authorities and how they divvy up that funding and what it's being used for. And remember also academies is going to be different as well. Like how is academies using funding to help support inclusion and SEND, you know, it's also going to be a part of that postcode lottery too. So there's one thing about a local authority having the funding, but another thing about how they actually facilitate and use it for SEND inclusion and for those students. So how is the resources divvied up, you know?
Yeah, I mean, how is that decided, Michal?
Well, I think if you're in an academy, it's about what the priority is, you know, and where people are pushing it and saying it's a priority. I think there's something to say about the new Ofsted framework coming in and how inclusion is really goldenly threaded through it. And it'd be interesting to see what's going to come because of it. You know, are people going to be investing more in mainstream inclusion because of that? Because it all of a sudden becomes a reason that you could be graded or looked at. And that shouldn't be a reason, of course not, but it'd be interesting to see what's going to happen because of it, you know? And I think, you know, again, it becomes, it's like every local authority that you know, Kelly and I read a lot local stuff, and we read about the local authorities near us who are reaching high levels of deficit and crisis points. And it's about how they're using their resources and how much is being divvied up and put out to independent settings. And is there better collaborative, functional, strategic systems that we can do to help support with the things that we already have, the resources we have on site, you know?
So in terms of actual teaching, what would you say, I'll start with you, Michal, then move on to Kelly. What would you say are the biggest misconceptions that maybe teachers have about SEND and SEND teaching?
Oh, wow, that is David, that is a very broad question. I don't know if it's about, from my experiences, I don't know if it's a misconception. I think there's lots of threads to this. One is the pressures that teachers go through depending on what the outcomes of the values are of schools and what they are expected to do. Another thread is like education and learning and knowing, you know, about what SEND needs are and how do they best support those. You know, what does universal learning design look like? What every child should have in a classroom setting that will help all children? You know, that kind of thing is really, really important. There's lots of, that's a very weighted question because it depends on the sector, the school systems, the values. There's a lot of pressure on teachers to achieve certain things, I think, depending on secondary, mainstream, primary, or SEND, you know. And I think in a SEND school, we're very lucky that we can be a bit more individualized. We can be a bit more child focused. Where in mainstream settings, there's different levels of pressures.
What would you say, Kelly?
I mean, I agree with Michal, and I think there's something about recognizing that everyone is in education because they want to do what's best by the young people that they serve and the families that they serve. The busyness of the system, the high stakes accountability stuff, really inhibits people feeling able to take risks and progressive in educational design, in learning designs, and having the space and the capacity to even begin to research it, because it's not something that you'll naturally come across in teacher training, for example. SEND, maybe if you're lucky, a day. That doesn't cover the breadth that you're going to have in your classroom. But there are some quick wins, I think, that we can do more so now than ever, especially with the advent of AI, in terms of supporting lesson planning and ideas and how we think about our young people.
So how much do you think teachers should know about neurodiversity? Like, what should their sort of level? Should they know anything? Should they know something? Should they be experts? I mean, what would you say to that? I'll start with you, Kelly. What would you? This is a mainstream setting, not a special needs school. So
Yeah.
I'm a mainstream teacher. I teach at a sixth form college. How much do you think it helps if my knowledge of neurodiversity, or is it just, no, you should teach the same way to all students and just understand all their needs?
Wow. That's an interesting question. Simply because I think your last comment really talks to potential generalization and possible ableism if we just teach what we know in the same way to everyone all of the time. And I think, I mean, if I'm a teacher who doesn't diversify everything they do every day for a vast majority of young people, it's just a difference. People, practitioners should really see it as a difference and not a deficit. These young people aren't less than, they're just experiencing your environment differently. So I think having an allyship approach that really empowers you as a practitioner to understand why a young person is showing up in the way that they are is going to help you make sense of how you can then adjust and adapt to support that young person. Being curious about how a young person's presenting is a place to start, and you don't have to be thinking about ND to be curious. It doesn't have to be just that one sector of our learning population. I think there are probably key principles that we can apply that really resonate across everybody that we serve, really, by just thinking, okay, this is a difference. Behavior is a form of communication. Consistency is calming, so how can I provide that? And sensory environments matter, and they don't just matter to ND specific folk. As Michal said right at the beginning of our conversations, that we are all neurodiverse. Neurodivergent folk, it just means that there's a minority of people who experience it slightly differently. So trying to work out how they're experiencing your environment is a great place to start. And there are simple things you can do, such as going onto YouTube, for example, and looking at videos of experiences. There's a great one that I've used with my team around an ND child walking through a shopping centre, and you're seeing it, from their point of view, how they're experiencing it. And suddenly, having watched that, the amount of dialogue that came about, oh my goodness, I didn't know that would be the case for that young person, or oh my gosh, I experienced that too. And suddenly there's this greater widening of thinking around, oh, we can do this differently, or maybe I can turn my lights off and that will help. Sometimes it's the simplest things that make the biggest difference.
And I want to just, sorry, Michal, I was just going to hook into that sensory environment idea. If I, for teachers listening out there who are like, oh, that sounds very interesting, what could they practically be doing to improve the sensory environment?
I mean, what I'd always be saying is that, like what Kelly was saying, is that there is recently I've been reading so much about universal design for learning. So what is it that all teachers can be doing to help support consistency and total communication in the classroom? So how do you bring a very overstimulated environment to a place where everybody will access the learning in a calm, safe way. Decluttering, safe spaces to go to, visual timetables that will help support students learning. I know that if I was going through school, if I had a visual timetable, something written down, and a decluttered place where I could process better, it would have helped all 30 kids in my setting at that time. Thinking about transitions when students are going from transition from noisy classrooms, that kind of focused learning right from the beginning that builds self-confidence. Those are the kinds of things where there is a lot to do about universal learning for design that all lessons should have. Visual things, symbols, pictures. What are kinds of things that can be put in place for all lessons that you do? We're very much at front of the school, front of the classroom teaching, aren't we? Well, actually, could we teach that same thing in different ways?
Mm. Yeah, no, I just love that term. So universal design for learning. So the idea being that you're thinking about every individual student, what is coming for all students, and by that sense, what you're saying is you will be helping all students, including those in your class that maybe are, neurodivergent in a sense. That's the idea that you're
I mean,
talking about?
I think there are like things that can be done that are universal, and I will always believe that the next layer to that is about knowing your student. I will always believe, like Kelly and I will always believe, that it starts with the adult, and knowing the student, and I guarantee you most teachers do that anyways by the kind of conversations that they might have in it. But yes, there are certain things that could be done universally that would help all students in the first instance. It's a good place to start, isn't it? With inclusion and inclusive practice, especially in mainstream settings. And I know we're talking about mainstream here.
There are basic design principles that we can all access quite easily, that we know impacts ourselves as humans being. Things like biophilic environmental design is simple, natural light, plants, greenery, natural textures and materials, thinking about your airflow and ventilation. What can you see? Have you got windows outside? Are your rooms visually distracting or visually calming? Those kind of questions, they are basic design principles that do have an impact on everybody, and potentially,
What's
if you
on
choose
your
the right
wall?
ones, a positive impact.
What's on your walls? Where
Yeah.
they're located. I mean, one of the biggest things I always say to teachers is that you might create an environment, but have you gone and sat down in that environment and seen how that child experiences it? Because it's very easy
At
for us.
their level.
Yes, at their level. Like, you might sit, oh, we're going to do mainstream mainstream primary schools. We're going to do a carpet time, and the children are sitting and the teacher's sitting on a chair above them. I mean, those are
Not
the
feeling the rough carpet.
and those are the kinds of things to consider, right? When you think about universal learning again, what is the environment looking? Does that teacher take the time to look at it in their perspective, in their vision? Where are they sitting? Where is that table? I mean, one of the best practices I've ever seen is a teacher who goes and sits at every single chair after she's recreated or he has created it, to see what that child is experiencing.
I think it's also really easy to dismiss lived experiences just because you that's not your experience. So I'll give you an example of me. So I hear electricity. Now I know that sounds really strange, but my ears are just hypersensitive, and I can hear when lights are on. Where other people won't notice it, to the point where I've been like, I think I'm going mad. Can you hear that? Can anyone hear it? No one can seem to hear it. And someone came in to check, an electrician, and he went, you can hear that? And I was like, I really can, and I cannot focus on anything else because it's making that noise. He's like, you do know that kind of pitch is the type of noise that dogs would pick up, not humans. And I was like, well, thanks for that. Thanks very much. But until he verified that my experience was real, my colleagues were, you are mad. There is no sound in this room, and yet I could not tune it out. So when children are expressing how they're experiencing your environment, and if it's not true to the way you're experiencing it, do you still lean into it and be curious about their experience and making it better? Because, we are all different, and we all do hear different things and experience it in a different way.
Yeah, I guess my next question is just about displays. We seem to be moving, a long time ago when I first started teaching. I'm sure it was the case with you. We wanted these classrooms that were full of images and they were alive and full of color, and it was this great environment, and we were really sort of pushed towards that. Now we seem to be moving away from that, and I think it seems to be a good thing based on science. But is that the sort of big move? Not, I guess we're not talking about a room that's devoid of life, but not overpowering with a lot of images that are maybe not technically related to the lesson itself. Is that the idea that we're sort of moving towards?
I think, David, we'd always be asking the question, and this is the question that Kelly and I always ask, is who are we doing it for? So if you are doing things like boards and, things on the wall or visual timetable, always ask yourself, who am I doing this for? So if I'm doing it for that particular student, am I doing it the right way for them? Am I doing it for the group of students? Is this what they're going to gain from it? Is that the objective? Am I doing it to show color on the wall? Well, actually, what's the impact of that?
Is that what you'd be saying as well, Kelly?
Yeah, I would. Quite often when I used to work in a school where we used to have to get rulers, and the borders had to be 2 centimeters apart from each other, and you had to definitely have 3 every single time. Had to be double backed, and then the children's work had to be laminated and had to be stapled, and each had to be in the right corner. And if you didn't, oh my goodness, you were in trouble with SLT. I mean, that was not a piece of learning that my young people were getting access to at that point in time. That was about how things looked like to the grown-ups when they were showing people around. Active walls are great, but also having a way of muting those when you don't need that visual stimulation available to your young people is a great way of having life on the wall, but being able to mute it down. And I think it's about having spaces that flex to what's needed in that time and space that helps the most.
So
I love that term, spaces that flex.
Yeah, and so some of the greatest things that I've seen are things like sensory walls, where like kids can touch, even in sixth form colleges, I've seen this, where there's like a lovely row of things outside where they can touch and feel and fidget as they walk down the hall to help them regulate to the next bit, So there are like flexible sensory, again, when I go back to who is it for, how are you supporting it and why are you doing it? It always goes back to why are you doing it, right?
Yeah, because even blank space isn't wasted space. It's regulation space, potentially.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. So I'm going to go to the news, and then we're going to be talking to Stephanie Pastoris about post-16, and I'm going to come back to Michal and Kelly in the last 10 minutes. Thanks so much for your comments. I think that was absolutely brilliant, and I'll be speaking to you later in the show.
Thanks, David.
Thank you so much.
Problem. Cheers.
Teachers Talk Radio.
Hi, secondary school teachers. We're Apps for Good, and we give schools like yours free introductory computing courses. Our courses are for everyone, including those who aren't computing teachers, and they're fully equipped with resources mapped to the UK computing curriculums. Independent learning is central to our courses. Your students will develop essential and digital skills by working in teams to create prototype apps. We'll even connect you with industry volunteers to give real-world feedback. Let's empower every young person you teach to shape their future with technology. Speak to us at www.appsforgood.org.
Did you know that every year, half of disadvantaged children who are top attainers at primary school don't go on to achieve top GCSE maths results? At Axiom Maths, we exist to change that. Our fully funded program helps schools nurture young mathematicians through weekly face-to-face maths circles, where pupils tackle challenging and exciting problems outside the national curriculum. With just under £3,000 annual funding, expert training and quality resources, we give schools everything they need to inspire the next generation of mathematical thinkers. Want to make a difference? Visit AxiomMaths.com today and join over 400 schools delivering maths circles across the UK.
Meet 2025 BET Award winner Kialo EDU, the 100% free tool for thoughtful, inclusive classroom discussion. On Kialo, students contribute instantly and simultaneously to create an interactive map of a discussion, deepening their subject knowledge and enhancing their critical thinking skills. Set tasks, track participation, and provide personalized feedback in just a few clicks. And since it's compatible with all your favorite LMS platforms, it slots seamlessly into your existing workflow. Over 1 million educators and students are already using Kialo to make the world a more thoughtful place. Join them today at kialo-edu.com.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
Teachers' pay is back in the news in Northern Ireland after Belfast Live reports that teachers have rejected a proposed pay deal for a second time. The Northern Ireland Teachers' Council, which represents the teaching unions in negotiations with management, said members were still not prepared to accept the 5.5% uplift offer. Teachers rejected an initial offer in February. A new offer was tabled by management last week and included what was described as an enhanced package of commitments around reducing workload, but it was again rejected. Teachers in Northern Ireland have been taking industrial action short of strike during the dispute. Members of several unions have already voted in favour of strike action if the impasse is not resolved. Full details of the story can be found online. In Sunderland, the city's university has had its new £10 million campus officially opened by the Secretary of State for Education, Bridget Phillipson. Phillipson is also the city's MP. The new facility is located at the university's London site, close to Canary Wharf. Set to train the business leaders, financiers and NHS workforce of the future. The report in the Sunderland Echo details commentally positive impact this Sunderland has had on and to see the university expand out. Among academic courses on offer, the new Harbour Exchange campus aims to provide qualifications and opportunities to hundreds of nurses over the next 5 years. Meanwhile, online news and comment site The Tab features research by The Telegraph which suggests that there are more people with depression and anxiety in places with lots of students. According to the online article, 4 cities with Russell Group universities stood out as having high numbers of people seeking support for mental health. Experts have suggested a number of reasons for university students experiencing poor mental health, including the rise of social media, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, the cost of living crisis, and other financial worries. The cities included in the report are Leeds, Bristol, Liverpool, and Nottingham. Deadline News Agency also explores this issue. It focuses on Edinburgh University's decision to bring alpacas onto campus in an effort to tackle anxiety. The university holds regular Pause Against Stress sessions where dogs visit students, and alpacas have also returned for a second time. The animals first appeared in 2022 and have returned to support students as they approach their final exam period. Sky News covers new evidence from the Office of the Children's Commissioner for England, which suggests that children who are repeatedly uprooted from their homes go on to achieve fewer GCSEs. The article says that for the first time, research proves the negative impact housing insecurity has on educational attainment. Each additional address move was linked to a fall in achievement of the accepted standard of 5 GCSE passes, including English and Maths at grade 4. Only half of the children who moved 3 times between reception and year 11 went on to achieve the 5, compared to 65% for those with 1 home address in the same period. This fell to 1 in 10 amongst those who moved 10 times throughout their education. The report goes on to cover the further impact on those moving between a series of temporary accommodation and the links with child poverty and the increasing gap between disadvantaged children and their non-disadvantaged peers. Full details can be found on the Sky News website. Finally, the Mail Online covers the story of two parents who sold their family home and quit their jobs to travel the world with their 3 children. The article describes the family of 5 as modern-day nomads who have travelled to Thailand, China, Malaysia and Dubai whilst homeschooling their children. The parents believe their children are better off travelling the world than attending traditional schools, as they have no faith in the UK education system, but that the children do follow the national curriculum. When asked about their children missing out on friendships, both parents said they weren't concerned as the benefits outweighed the downsides. This has been Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
Cool. And we are back. So I'm going to introduce our next guest, which is Stephanie Pastoris. Stephanie, are you there?
Hello, yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Fantastic. Yes, you're coming through nice and clear. So would you like to introduce yourself to our listeners and just tell them a bit about your background and your role?
Yes, of course. Hi, my name is Stephanie. I am the head of study support at a large sixth form college. I'm a colleague of David's. I have been at the college in the study support department for the last 15 years as a specialist teacher first, and then the last 4 years as the head of study support.
Yeah. And so, yes, this is a first. Stephanie is the first of my colleagues I've ever had on my show. So this is very special, Stephanie. Is there anything you wanted to add to the conversation I was having earlier with Michal and Kelly?
Oh my gosh. Well, just agreeing with everything they were saying, everything about, how we should kind of flip the idea of trying to, when you were asking about the challenges for teachers, kind of, I suppose trying to not worry too much about knowing everything about every diagnosis, but really thinking about, what needs can I see in front of me and how can I support that need? I think teachers are already extremely overwhelmed by their workload, and I don't think we can reasonably expect from teachers to know everything about every single neurodivergence and every single diagnosis. I think that's just impossible. I think teachers get really hung up on that. I think they worry a lot about not knowing enough and not feeling equipped for the job. But I think if we approach it from a point of, I've got a student with this need in front of me, perhaps they're highly anxious or perhaps they're struggling to, read long text or whatever, then I can identify that need and I can see what can I do in this moment? How can I adapt my teaching, or how can I teach in a very inclusive way to support that that student, rather than thinking, oh my gosh, what's going on? Are they autistic? Are they dyslexic? Does that make sense? Do you see where I'm coming from?
Yeah, definitely. So how different is the post-16 environment in terms of your role and in SEND, with the EHCPs? Is it a case of because we're obviously at a sixth form college, is it a case that you're taking the reports that are already coming through high school, or how does the situation differ at a post-16 environment?
So particularly in our environment where we are, because we only offer level 3 qualifications, we are the students that we can take onto our courses, they have to meet our entry criteria. So that limits the number of EHCPs that we actually get, because if our students haven't met our entry criteria, we haven't got a course to offer them. So then they have to apply elsewhere where they can potentially access level 2 qualifications first before applying to us. They have got, as long as they're in FE further education, they have got their plan valid until the age of 25. So we can have students come to us who might be a little bit older than their peers. So we've got students applying for the first time when they're 17 or 18. But the other big thing really is when our students come to us, we often have to explain to parents that once they progress to university, the education and healthcare plan will cease. So that kind of phrasing is always very scary for parents because they have had to work very hard to get this plan in the first place. And then it's quite a daunting prospect that the plan's going to cease, that it's just going to stop. But what happens obviously next is that the student will be able to access the support and the funding via the disability student allowance when they go on to higher education. But as long as they stay in further education, they still need the support. They've got the plan until they're 25.
So it changes. So can you just elaborate on that a little bit? So they're coming from sort of high school to a sixth form college, and then at university,
Yes.
they're accessing a different
Yes, they're
need.
accessing a different stream of funding. So where they've been supported, the funding would have come from the local authority all the way through school and all the way through FE. When they go to higher education, they access their funding and their support via the disabled student allowance. So I know I've had students apply to university where the universities have actually said to them, well, we don't actually want to see your EHCP, we want to see your diagnosis.
And do you see that as a particular problem? Is that an issue, do you think, or it's just the way the system is?
It can be a problem because I have had a student who was quite high needs actually on an EHCP. He never had a diagnosis. He got the EHCP based on his needs at primary school even. And obviously he'd had the support all the way through. And even at college when he was with us, we supported him all the way through as a high needs student. So that means you claim additional funding on top of the funding that you get from the local authority. So you claim more funding to support the student. And when that student went to university, because he'd never had a formal diagnosis, they wouldn't support him any further. They were not accepting of his plan. So that was very, very difficult. I don't actually know what happened with that student. And my hands were tied because all I could say to the mum was, he's got this plan and this is your evidence, use it with universities. But she was really struggling with that. It seemed like they really were just interested in a diagnosis. But equally, that's quite unusual. Most students will receive a diagnosis and the EHCP will then be issued based on that. So there's usually a diagnosis of autism or ADHD or some need that's been diagnosed, dyslexia and so on. And then they've still got that paperwork that they can then produce as evidence.
And do you get many students at post-16 who are being diagnosed for the first time, or is that very rare?
No, we get a lot. Yeah, it's quite common. And I think it's because the step up from GCSEs is quite a big step. So they might have been able to cope or mask all the way through secondary school, and then they come to us and the demand is just so high at A levels. It's just immense demand on academic demand, social demand. It becomes really difficult for someone with autism, for example, to mask and to cope with all the added demand on them. And so we do have quite a lot of parents and students asking for support with referrals to be assessed and diagnosed with neurodivergence.
And what about the increase? Have you seen a considerable increase, say, in the last 10 years or so?
Definitely. Huge increase. And I would say that was massively exacerbated by COVID as well. Certainly after COVID, there seemed to have been just a massive explosion in the need for diagnoses. More and more we have students, ADHD, that's the latest thing. So when I first started at college, it was all dyslexia, everyone was dyslexic. And then a few years after that, it was autism, everyone was autistic. And now it seems that ADHD is the new buzzword. Everyone wants a diagnosis of ADHD. So the number of feedback forms we receive from mostly private assessors through our inbox and study support asking for teacher feedback for someone who wants to be assessed for ADHD. It's just, I would say on average about 3 or 4 a week.
So are you saying that partly that's, I guess, what would I say? Like there is partly because we're better at assessing, but also there seems to be a certain, I guess, percentage of students who are pushing, or parents that are pushing for this, that maybe the need is different. Is that what you're saying? Or like, what would you put it down to, this great sort of surge in the amount of students looking for support?
There's so many reasons. I think we're in quite an affluent area, and I think parents can afford to investigate and go private. The NHS waiting lists are just so long, 2.5, 3 years. You'll be sitting on a waiting list before you get seen and assessed. So where we are, parents can afford to kind of get their children seen quite quickly and diagnosed quite quickly. I think a lot of our students and a lot of the kind of interest in neurodivergence and being diagnosed is also this kind of focus on social media, TikTok. ADHD is all over TikTok. Students are constantly almost self-diagnosing themselves. And I think after what happened over COVID as well, parents were at home, they saw their children learning, they might have felt a little bit concerned by what they were seeing, whereas before that they didn't know how their children behaved when they were learning. So I think there was just more awareness on parents' side. There's just a lot in the media on this. The more students that get diagnosed, the more their peers are interested and kind of see traits in themselves, and then they pursue diagnosis. It's so many reasons.
So do you think there is then an overdiagnosis, or do you think it's a bit of overdiagnosis and we're more in tune to students? So it's a bit of a combination.
I think it's a combination of. I think a lot of what we see could potentially be supported without a diagnosis. I think a lot of the need that we see, you know, from my perspective, I feel like we need to be quite careful in terms of what the Equality Act 2010, how that describes disability in terms of how it affects your ability, you know, to do your day-to-day, participate in your day-to-day life. And I feel like almost when we hit that almost criteria that you're not able to participate in your day-to-day, you're that debilitated, then I think it's a good idea to pursue a diagnosis. But I almost think like, you know, yes, we've all got traits of neurodivergence. We're all somewhere on the spectrum. And if you can cope with your day to day, obviously we all have hard days, don't we? We all have days where we just think, oh, I really can't cope with today. But if for the most part you can cope with your day to day, and you perhaps need a little bit of support here or there, or maybe some strategies to help you. So, for example, if you're struggling with attention and focus, and maybe a few strategies here or there to support your attention and your focus, your organization, your executive functioning, then, you know, I think we should think carefully about pursuing a diagnosis, because it is, at the end of the day, it's a disability. And it's a lifelong disability. Once you've got diagnosis, it's, you know, you're never not going to have a diagnosis. It's going to go with you for life.
So I know you've talked a lot about needs versus labels. Could you just explain that a little bit more?
Yes. So I want our teachers to not have a huge focus on labels and diagnoses. And the reason for that is because every student is an individual. So every single student will have their own strengths and their own needs. And when someone has a diagnosis, so let's say, for example, autism, it's very easy for us to have this kind of subconscious bias whereby we put the student in a box and we say, right, that student is autistic. That means I know a little bit about autism. I know that student can do this and that student can't do that. And thinking like that is very harmful to that student, because the student is an individual. You know, when you've worked with one autistic student, you've worked with one autistic student. So we have to take that student as an individual. We have to get to know them really well. We have to focus on their strengths, and we have to support whatever needs they have as in individual needs. So this is why, for me, we should not be thinking about labels and diagnosis. We should be thinking about an individual and their needs, so that we don't, you know, disadvantage them or lower our expectations of them in any way.
So what would you describe as inclusive adapted teaching?
So inclusive adaptive teaching. So inclusive teaching is to just high quality teaching based in the science of learning. So, it's things like Rose and Shine for Mastery. It's this whole idea of how our teachers should be teaching through explicit instruction, through the idea of kind of chunking, modeling, scaffolding, elaborating, and so on. So it's this idea of teaching explicitly. And it's not the kind of old-fashioned idea of creating individual lesson plans or differentiating tasks for students, or kind of offering minimal guidance where students kind of discover concepts for themselves. It's really about explicit teaching and making sure that you're providing those kind of scaffolds so that students can access the work, and not making it easier. And through this explicit instruction and through really good, high quality, kind of rooted in the science of learning, you will be able to meet the needs of a majority of the students a majority of the time without the need for separate intervention. And then adaptive teaching is where you notice. So you've got a student in front of you and you notice that, they're either doing really, really well. So I'm going to maybe need to give them maybe another question to do, or there's a need, they're struggling with something, and you're doing something in that moment to address that need. It's not anything kind of rocket sciencey or anything. It could be simple stuff like making eye contact, maybe prompting, really simple adaptive strategies. And then when you find that through inclusive adaptive teaching, the student is still struggling, then you refer the student up. So that's your kind of universal provision, is the inclusive adaptive teaching. And then you can kind of move your student up into targeted provision. That's kind of where you've got your learning support, and in our case, study support and so on. And we can move up even higher to specialist provision. But it's this idea of your wave 1, wave 2, wave 3 support. And your teacher is responsible for all the students learning in that class. So that wave 1 support, that's the teacher's responsibility. It's not the SENCO's or study support's responsibility.
So when you go into classes, I know you do a lot of learner walks, you're going into classrooms. What are some of the practical advice you would say for teachers listening to this tonight? What are some of the things you observe where you're like, oh, you could do, these 3 things immediately to help all learners, but particularly the students that you're, there to observe in terms of study support?
Okay, so what I look at, particularly when I go and do a learning walk, is kind of how the lesson is structured. If the lesson is structured in a way whereby at the start there is some kind of a review of what we've already learned. So there's this kind of idea of revisiting previously learned content, because we need to build from simple steps to more complex steps. So this idea of revisiting, reviewing. And then I like to see whether there's some kind of a context, a positioning of what learning is going to take place today and where it sits in the whole curriculum and in terms of where it sits in the exam. So just this idea of giving context to the students, because it's very important for them to kind of have this bigger picture of where they're learning, where the learning that they're doing, where it sits. And then I really would like to see some kind of a very brief, hopefully, I like the idea of the kind of 10-2 principle, whereby teachers, where they kind of chunk the learning in a very clear, structured way, in a very explicit way, as I said before. And, the idea of not talking too much, but being conscious of your students' cognitive load, the cognitive ability, how much they can actually remember, the working memory capacity, and so on. So just being conscious of that, so we're not talking too much at our students, but giving them that time for about 10 minutes where you're talking, giving them that kind of processing time where they can really process and understand, make sense of what they are learning. So this idea of almost giving them time to chew on what you've taught them, giving them time to work with that, whether that's with peers, whether that's with an exercise you're giving, and then where the teacher is checking for understanding and trying to very quickly, as quickly as possible, identify any gaps in learning, any misunderstanding, and correcting that as quickly as possible before that whatever's going on in the working memory turns into long-term memory and that learning takes place that's incorrect. So, making sure that that very structured approach is followed, and that learning, that the learning environment is absolutely maximized for a student.
I guess my sort of reply to that is that sounds just like excellent teaching. So are you saying we're sort of moving away from this idea of, send students versus other students? I mean,
Yes.
I guess if I'm a teacher saying, oh, but I've got these students with particular,
Yes.
labels, or I've got these sort of students with autism or ADHD, you say, like, try and move away from that and just look at the class more, not holistically, but your own teaching, and it will sort of work for all students.
Yes, exactly. If you try and think about keeping your teaching in a simple, structured way, clear language, say what you mean what you say, kind of thing, keeping the whatever you're putting on the slide, keeping that kind of to a minimum as well, where you've just got bullet points, you're not overloading so basically you teach to your SEND students. You are going to be teaching to everybody. So this idea of, in the past, where we had, right, I'm going to do my lesson plan, and then afterwards I'm going to sit and think about who's in my class. Okay, I've got that one with dyslexia, I've got that one with autism. So, right, what am I going to do for this dyslexic student? I'll do this worksheet, or I'll do that worksheet. That's completely debunked now. We don't do that kind of differentiation anymore. We've got high expectations of all of them, and particularly at sixth form, they've all got to sit the same exam. I can't be differentiating for students like that. I've got to teach my curriculum to all of them. So if I teach to those SEND students, regardless of whatever label there is, by using these strategies that I know that's rooted in science, as you say, it's just excellent teaching, then I'm gonna hit that sweet spot.
And then I guess my follow-up question to that is, how much should, you're not saying the teachers should not be aware of those aspects. So how does that sort of fit in? I mean, I totally agree with what you're saying in terms of excellent teaching, and I can see that. So I guess someone listening would be like, well, do I need to be aware of their plans at all? So how does that fit in?
Yeah, you do need to be aware of their plans. That is important, but you shouldn't be too hung up on whatever broad category their plan sits in. So you shouldn't be too worried about whether their plan is based on cognition and learning or social emotional mental health, or whatever the kind of broad category of need is. You should be getting to know that student. That's the first thing you should be doing as a teacher. You should build that trust relationship, and you should be getting to know that student really, really well. So you know what makes them tick. You should come from a place of, I've got really high expectations for the student. I really like them. I want them to do as well as everyone else. You start by presuming competence, and then you start by really thinking about building that relationship, that kind of relate, that triangle that we always talk about, this kind of where you regulate, relate, and reason. You kind of build that trust relationship, and you get to know that student on a personal level. You know what makes them tick, and you know what works for them, and you know where their needs are. So almost you've got the paperwork. The paperwork can tell you a lot about a student, but very often the EHCP is so outdated, and it's not the person you've got in front of you. So it's almost like, yes, okay, I've got the paperwork. I know I've got a high need student in front of me, and I know they've got a diagnosis of dyslexia. But who are they? Who are they really? And then find out what their needs are and teach adaptively to those needs.
I mean, we talk a lot about relationships.
Mm.
I mean, relationships with students is so important. Is it a different element when you're talking about SEND students? I know that you and I have talked a lot about this in terms of, relationships are so important in SEND teaching, but is it any more or less, or is it just different? I mean, what's the sort of, I guess, sort of golden point with this? Yeah.
It's is potentially more important with our SEND students, because often, the trust relationship for them is so important, because it's just the way the brain works, isn't it? When your brain, so with our students who have diagnosis of neurodivergence, we know that very often they live in, their window of tolerance, they live in either a hyper aroused state or a hypo aroused state. And so when they don't trust the adult in the room, or when they don't know you well enough to trust you yet, then often they're not going to be in a receptive state to learning. So it is very important for us. I think our neurotypical kids are perhaps more able to engage what I like to call the kind of thinking brain over the emotional brain. They're more able to kind of filter out a lot of these disturbances like sensory input and so on, and they're more able to quickly kind of engage with someone else and engage their thinking brain. But with our neurodivergent kids, we know that when they're either hyper aroused or hypo aroused, the thinking brain isn't engaged, and this is why it's so important for us to have that relationship with them, so that once they feel safe in an environment and with a person, then they can engage their thinking brain, and that's really when learning can take place. It's so important. Before they're in that state of mind, they're sitting there wasting their time. There's no learning going on.
And can you explain to our listeners, what do you mean by hypo? What was the term you used? Sorry, Steph.
Okay, so you've got hyper arousal, and that's basically your fight and flight response. So when we're highly anxious, you start going into fight or flight response. You're basically this is where we see the meltdowns, where we have students angry, shouting, lashing out, very kind of sometimes, quite often the boys may be swearing, storming out or whatever, and that's your fight or flight. And then your hypoarousal is where you've got, and this we often see with the girls, where they're kind of almost in freeze mode. They're tired, they're lying on the desk, on their arms, they just look sleepy, lethargic, and they're not learning because they just look almost spaced out, like they're not there.
And what's the causation of that? If I'm a teacher, how do I want to avoid that? Is it just, in the day, you're obviously just overloaded with sensory, with information? Does the time of day, it sounds like, matters quite a lot as a teacher to be aware of?
It really can be. It really depends on the individual. It's you might have heard about the spoons analogy. Like when we all wake up with, say, 10 spoons every morning, and when you're neurotypical, maybe you use up one spoon, for example, just to get to work in the morning, and then you spill your coffee. Maybe that takes 2 spoons, but by the end of the day, you've maybe used up all your 10 spoons, and you're just exhausted. You go home and you just sit in front of the TV. You're just knackered. But when you're maybe someone with autism, you might use up 5 spoons in the morning just because your breakfast, there's no milk in the fridge for your breakfast. And by the time you get to college, you've maybe only got 5 spoons left, and then maybe you get into the lesson, say history, and your teacher says, right, we're going to do a pop quiz, and it's not your routine. You didn't have any pre-warning of that, and there's your last 5 spoons, and immediately you're hyper aroused and you're having a meltdown, shouting at the teacher, storming out of the class. So it really depends on the kind of day you have. It depends on what's happened in the morning. There's no kind of, I can't say to you, Dave, every period 5 is going to be horrific. So you just don't know. And I suppose it's a really good way sometimes how we do it at college, where we kind of email each other during the day and say, look, this hasn't worked very well in my lesson, so just a heads up for the next lesson. That kind of thing, where you communicate with your colleagues about a student that might have a meltdown.
Yeah, so it's about communication with teachers and being aware. Routine seems to be a massive thing, Steph, in terms of keeping a routine.
Yeah.
And the next thing I was going to say, I guess, like Kelly and Michal were saying, having a classroom that's not overpowering in a sensory element.
That's right. Yes. Sensory clean classrooms as much as you can. Just be careful of overstimulating. Always ask yourself, just like Michal and Kelly was saying, ask yourself, how much energy are you draining simply by being in that environment?
Yeah, and routines.
Routine the same. Be really clear about what happens when. If every lesson has the same routine, obviously you can mix it up a little bit. One day a quiz, the next day a Kahoot, whatever. But if students know exactly what to expect, that reduces cognitive load because they're not sitting there worrying about what's going to come next. They know what's going to come next. They can focus on the learning. They feel, they've got psychological safety. They appreciate, they feel safe. They feel safe with you, they feel safe in the environment, they feel safe in their learning. So routine is really, really important for all students, but particularly for our autistic students.
And just before we go to the next ad break, can you just explain that term, psychological safety? What does that mean to a teacher listening? Is like, okay, what does that mean?
Yeah, so it just comes back to what I was saying earlier about the trust relationship. So feeling like you're in a safe space, you're with a safe adult, they've got your back, they're not going to do anything to upset you, make you feel, psychologically unsafe. It's really important for our students who have suffered, trauma of any kind, adverse childhood experiences, our autistic students, neurodiverse students, ADHD, all of those conditions. It's really important that we try and establish psychological safety for those students, and it can just be simple things like at the start of the year when they're still getting to know you as that trusted adult in the class, where you kind of don't cold call on them until they trust you, until they know that the reason you're doing it is in their best interest and you're doing it to help them, and that all the kind of things like fostering a culture of making mistakes where they understand why you want them to make mistakes and how important it is. But just building up to that trust and creating that kind of psychological safety through that trust relationships.
Fantastic. So we're going to go to our final ad break. Stay tuned. And then I'm going to bring back all my guests for some final thoughts.
Hi, secondary school teachers. We're Apps for Good, and we give schools like yours free introductory computing courses. Our courses are for everyone, including those who aren't computing teachers, and they're fully equipped with resources mapped to the UK computing curriculums. Independent learning is central to our courses. Your students will develop essential and digital skills by working in teams to create prototype apps. We'll even connect you with industry volunteers to give real-world feedback. Let's empower every young person you teach to shape their future with technology. Speak to us at www.appsforgood.org.
Did you know that every year, half of disadvantaged children who are top attainers at primary school don't go on to achieve top GCSE maths results? At Axiom Maths, we exist to change that. Our fully funded program helps schools nurture young mathematicians through weekly face-to-face maths circles, where pupils tackle challenging and exciting problems outside the national curriculum. With just under £3,000 annual funding, expert training and quality resources, we give schools everything they need to inspire the next generation of mathematical thinkers. Want to make a difference? Visit axiommaths.com today and join over 400 schools delivering maths circles across the UK.
Meet 2025 BET Award winner Kialo EDU, the 100% free tool for thoughtful, inclusive classroom discussion. On Kialo, students contribute instantly and simultaneously to create an interactive map of a discussion, deepening their subject knowledge and enhancing their critical thinking skills. Set tasks, track participation, and provide personalized feedback in just a few clicks. And since it's compatible with all your favorite LMS platforms, it slots seamlessly into your existing workflow. Over 1 million educators and students are already using Kialo to make the world a more thoughtful place. Join them today at kialo-edu.com.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Cool. So I think we're all back. Steph, can you hear me? Michal?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
And I think, Kelly, are
Yeah.
you there?
I am.
Cool. Fantastic. Look, thank you. So I've got so many questions and we've only got 8 minutes left. So I think we're going to have to definitely do a follow-up sometime in the year because there's just so much to talk about. So I guess I've got a big sort of final question for all three of you. And I was thinking about it in the break. And my question is, if you could ask sort of one thing from the government to do and then one thing for teachers to do, what would it be? I'll give you a little bit of time to think about that because it's quite a big way to end. So it's one thing that if you could say to the government, we need this one thing for you to listen to and do, and then one thing you would say to teachers, like, this is what we would like you to do. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Who? I mean, I know it's a big way to end, but does who would like to be brave and go first?
I'll go first.
Okay, no worries. Yeah.
So I think in a way I'd probably ask both to do something similar in the sense, in the first instance, be curious. So like in the thing that's coming right now is there's a big ways of change coming, and we need to think of things differently. So the first step is always to be curious, ask questions, find out, learn the landscape, what's happening. And I would always ask that for teachers, like don't assume, don't have unconscious bias, do things differently, ask the questions and stretch your mind, be creative, take risks. So like that would be for for the teachers. I think for the government is don't be reactive. Like you've been doing the same thing for a really long time. Like look at things in a different way. Don't react to what's coming. Think strategically. Think it's going to take time. So it's okay if it's going to be hard for a little bit of time. But if you're willing to have the longer term vision to make things flexy and change things, then don't try to react to what's happening. Actually be the forefront of change, because places like Sweden and Finland and places like that have done it. So use our counterparts to learn from it too,
So, sorry, just to quickly, I know we haven't got much time, Michal. So there are places, it's interesting you just mentioned those places. There are places who have done better than the UK that we can use as a model.
Definitely. And it's not just like Scandinavian countries. It's also like, places in like America. And I know I dare say it, but there are like little places in mix of crannies of future education where people have done it in different ways and it has worked, so learn from people and places and be curious and look at things in a different, and I think education it has to be strategic, longer term strategy, not just reacting to it.
Let's go with you, Kelly. What would you say?
If I was going to ask for one thing from the government, it would be that they guarantee timely but researched, informed, fully funded support for all learners with accountability measures that stop the postcode lottery in terms of access and provision. If it were me asking for one thing from teachers, that's a little trickier. And like me, how curiosity was one of the big things. So I would be saying something along the lines of see behaviour as communication and respond with curiosity, not control. Co-construct, listen to their experiences, alongside looking to the progressive education movement in England. It already exists. There are already provisions out there that are doing things differently. And even if it's just a little bit different, can make all the difference to one particular learner in your class if you're informed about it and aware of these approaches.
So what is this? Sorry, just very quickly, just to follow up on that. What's the progressive education movement?
So essentially, there are practitioners all over the UK that are doing education differently, whether it's independent settings, grassroots settings, AP alternative provision settings, that are taking a research-informed approach to child-led learning to try and bridge the gap where mainstreams and maintained special schools are not meeting need, creating wonderfully diverse and progressive approaches to education that are having a real impact that still leads to high-level outcomes beyond GCSEs and access to university, and yet they've not been through or not going through a traditional conventional environment, and they are growing in number month by month.
That's really interesting. And Steph, to finish off, what would you say to the government and teachers, particularly in a post-16 setting?
Yeah, so to the government, I would love for the bureaucracy and all of that to be addressed in terms of EHCPs. I'd love a streamlined process. I'd love consistency across local authorities, much simpler access to specialist provision, and just consistency across the board. It's just so difficult working. In our case, we've got at the moment this year 4 local authorities that we work with, and they can't be different from each other, more different if they tried. It's just a nightmare for parents and for us and everyone. So I'd love for the government to address that in the first instance. And my message to teachers really is very similar to what Kelly and Michal have said as well. I would love for teachers to not be scared of SEND students. I would love for them to just see them, as we discussed, as the students in my class. They've got needs and I'm going to support them, and not to worry about, I've got SEND students, what am I going to do with them?
Fantastic. So thank you so much, guys. I always know when it's a great show because I get to the end and I'm like, I've got 100 questions that I wanted to ask, but I still haven't got to half of them. It's been so enlightening, so interesting. I think it was good to end with that. And, we started sort of with undoubtedly, I think we all agreed that what's happening in the UK, or England at least, in SEND is in crisis. But it does sound like there's great things happening. It's not complete doom and gloom, although there are issues and there are people doing amazing things that we can learn from. So, I just want to end with a slightly happier note than where we started. That's okay. And thank you so much for your time. That was such an amazing show. I hope it was really informative to all our listeners in terms of actual practical things they can do. And like I said, I think we need to do a follow-up later in the year because I've got so many other questions and things that were raised, particularly Michal right at the end where I'm like, oh, so there are places doing this better. I'd like to explore that a bit better. So thank you so much for your time. I hope all our listeners enjoyed it, but I really appreciate Stephanie, Michal and Kelly coming on tonight and giving up their time to talk to us about such an important issue. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's
Thanks,
such a
David.
pleasure. Thank you.
Fantastic. So to everybody out there, I hope you found that as interesting as I did. I'll be back at the end of April and stay tuned. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Cheers.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.